We know Cheech and Chong as the undisputed kings of stoner comedy. The hazy punchlines, the perfect comic chemistry, the counterculture films that somehow kept getting more absurd and more beloved at the same time. But behind the smoke and the cult classic status, there is a world of unexpected twists, bizarre coincidences, and backstage stories that most people have never heard. And in 2025, with cannabis now legal in more American states than ever, and a full-blown Cheech and Chong cultural renaissance quietly underway, new merchandise lines, documentary interest, and a fan base that spans 3 generations. The real story of how these two actually came together feels more worth telling than it ever has. Because this is not the sanitized version. Stick around until the end, because we are saving the most surprising fact for last. How they actually met. The origin story of Cheech and Chong is one of those real-life moments that feels almost too strange to be true, and the fact that it started in a topless bar in Vancouver only adds to the bizarre brilliance of it all. Richard Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong could not have come from more different worlds. Cheech was born in South Los Angeles, the son of a police officer, and had enrolled at California State University Northridge with ambitions that had nothing to do with comedy. He was studying pottery, kilns, clay wheels. Standing ovations were not part of the plan. But the late 1960s were a chaotic time for young American men. The Vietnam War draft cast a shadow over every decision, and when faced with the possibility of being shipped overseas to fight a war he did not believe in, Cheech made a decision that changed everything. He fled to Canada. "I didn't want to get killed in Vietnam," he would later say. Plain and simple. That choice planted him in Vancouver at precisely the right moment, though he had no way of knowing it yet. Living in a new country without a clear plan, Cheech took whatever work he could find. He drove trucks, he unloaded carpets, he kept working on his pottery. Then one night, looking for any job that could keep him afloat, he walked into a local club. Destiny, as it turned out, was waiting inside. Tommy Chong's path to that same room had been equally unconventional. Born in Edmonton, Alberta, to a Chinese father and a Scottish-Irish mother, Tommy had already tasted a different kind of fame as a musician. He had played guitar in a band called Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, which was signed by Motown Records. By itself, that could have been its own story. But by the early 1970s, Tommy had moved on from music and was running a topless bar in Vancouver's Chinatown called the Shanghai Junk. And being Tommy, he did not want to run just any topless bar. He blended burlesque with performance art, turning the Shanghai Junk into part strip club, part improv theater. He called his sketch group City Works, and they performed comedy between the dancers' routines. So one night in 1970, Cheech walked through the door looking for a job. Any job. Tommy saw something in him immediately. Maybe it was his timing, maybe his energy. Either way, he invited Cheech to join the improv group. And one night, mid-show, they started riffing off each other and fell into a bit about a guy looking for his friend Dave. The punchline, the other guy so stoned he kept saying, "Dave's not here," was completely unscripted. The audience went wild. Neither of them had planned it. But from that accidental moment, a comedy dynasty was born. Their love-hate relationship off stage. Behind the iconic film scenes and the thunderous laughter of sold-out theaters, the relationship between Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong was nothing like the carefree bromance fans assumed it to be. Sure, they looked inseparable on screen. Beneath the surface, their partnership was laced with friction, creative tension, and real animosity that stretched across nearly 2 decades. In his memoir, Cheech described their connection not as a friendship, but as a brotherhood, and not the warm, sentimental kind. "We're brothers. We're not best friends," he wrote. They could argue with alarming intensity in one moment, and then deliver a flawless comedy routine in the next, as if nothing had happened. Cheech compared their working relationship to the way pearls are formed, an irritation inside the shell that, under sustained pressure, produces something beautiful. The creative fault lines became most visible around the directorial credit on their films. While both were credited as writers across all 6 of their major films from 1978 to 1984, Tommy Chong directed 4 of them. For Cheech, this was not a minor bookkeeping detail. It became, in his own words, a very touchy thing. He felt his creative contributions were being minimized, and when Chong bluntly stated in a documentary that Cheech had never really earned the director title, Cheech shot back immediately. "That's a lie. I directed just as much as you did." The final break came in 1985. Cheech wanted Chong to help record his song, Born in East LA. Chong refused. That refusal ended 17 years of partnership. Cheech made the song and the film on his own, and both were critical and commercial successes. But underneath that success was a rupture that had finally broken open completely. Years later, with some distance and what sounded like genuine humility, Chong admitted the collapse was probably his fault. He had become, by his own description, something of a megalomaniac. Directing had given him a taste of authority he found difficult to relinquish. "Your words, God," he said, describing the trap he had fallen into. In 2025, both men are in their 80s, and the reunions and joint interviews that have continued sporadically still carry an edge that their most devoted fans recognize instantly. The chemistry is still there. So is the friction. Some things, it turns out, do not fully resolve. They just become part of the mythology. They were almost in a Friday the 13th movie. Here is where things get genuinely strange. Cheech and Chong were nearly cast in a Friday the 13th film. Not as victims, as themselves. After Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives breathed new life into the slasher franchise. In 1986, director Tom McLaughlin came up with an idea that was bold, a little insane, and honestly kind of brilliant. He pitched producer Frank Mancuso Jr. a crossover that would feature Cheech and Chong in the woods, either running a marijuana operation somewhere in the forest, or playing hapless camp counselors and completely over their heads. Either way, Jason Voorhees would have eventually found them. The studio did not move forward with it, and the crossover never happened. But the image of two laid-back stoners accidentally disrupting a slasher rampage remains one of Hollywood's great unmade scenarios. Given the current appetite for legacy horror franchise revivals, with Friday the 13th rights disputes finally showing signs of resolution in 2024 and 2025, the concept has quietly resurfaced in fan conversations online. Whether anyone in Hollywood is actually listening remains to be seen. That iconic license plate was a real cop's. One of the most memorable visual jokes in stoner film history is the muffed VR license plate in Up in Smoke. It has been referenced, recreated, and printed on merchandise for nearly 50 years, and almost nobody knows where it actually came from. Cheech and Chong did not invent it. The plate was a custom vanity plate belonging to an actual Los Angeles Police Department officer. A real cop was driving around Los Angeles with that plate on his car, apparently without apparent irony, before it ended up immortalized in one of the most counterculture films ever made. The plate had quite a journey before its cinematic debut. It started on an American Motors Gremlin, already legendary for being one of the most mocked cars in automotive history, then moved to a T-top Corvette, and eventually ended up on a customized VW Bug, which is where it appears in the film. That same Volkswagen, incidentally, was actually Jack Nicholson's personal car. So, to summarize, a real police officer's vanity plate, attached to Jack Nicholson's personal vehicle, became one of the defining images of anti-establishment stoner comedy. The original owner reportedly still has the plates today, complete with California DMV stickers. Reality, in this case, was significantly stranger than anything a Hollywood writer could have scripted. Jack Nicholson laughed through a dislocated shoulder. Speaking of Jack Nicholson, and Up in Smoke producer Lou Adler tells a story about an early screening of the film that has become one of the more extraordinary pieces of accidental film testing history. Nicholson attended the screening fresh from a car accident that had left him with a dislocated shoulder. He had been told by his doctor, in fairly unambiguous terms, not to laugh. Laughing, under those circumstances, would hurt. A lot. He laughed anyway. He could not stop himself. Every time a joke landed, Nicholson would involuntarily produce what Adler described as a series of grunts, groans, and pained exclamations because the laughter hurt, but it came regardless. And the filmmakers, watching Nicholson's agonized reactions from across the room, started using his involuntary sounds as a quality metric. If a joke could physically overpower a dislocated shoulder and drag a laugh out of Jack Nicholson against his doctor's explicit instructions, it was definitely staying in the film. Accidental, painful, and completely honest, which, in its own way, is a perfect description of everything Cheech and Chong ever made. Their script for Nice Dreams was 3.5 pages long. Cheech and Chong's 1981 film, Nice Dreams, had a screenplay. It was 3.5 pages long. Not 30, not 300. 3.5 pages to account for the basic idea, some visual cues, and a general sense that things would get weird. The original concept involved the two of them playing landscapers, secretly growing marijuana across Los Angeles, clipping hedges by day, harvesting by night. That idea eventually evolved into something involving selling weed from an ice cream truck with a giant clown face on the side, which is objectively an upgrade. What makes this genuinely remarkable is what happened next. Despite the near non-existent written foundation, the physical comedy and visual gags in Nice Dreams were storyboarded with meticulous precision. Every chase scene, every pratfall, every slapstick moment was pre-planned and choreographed in detail. The film that looks completely loose and chaotic on screen was, behind the scenes, carefully constructed. Cheech and Chong understood something that a lot of filmmakers miss: the most convincing spontaneity is usually the most carefully prepared. The 3.5-page script was not laziness. It was a deliberate choice to leave room for the physical work to carry the film, which it did. What Cheech and Chong actually built. Labeling Cheech and Chong as stoner comedians misses the point almost entirely. Cheech Marin voiced Bonsai in The Lion King and Ramon across the Cars franchise. He built one of the most significant private collections of Chicano art in the United States, a collection that has now toured major museums and generated serious critical attention. Tommy Chong's arrest and prosecution for selling glass pipes, documented in the film, aka Tommy Chong, became a genuine flashpoint in conversations about selective enforcement and a war on drugs, conversations that feel more relevant now than they did when the film was made. Both men stepped into voice, acting, activism, documentary filmmaking, and, in 2010, professional wrestling when they guest-hosted WWE Raw to promote their Get It Legal tour and got involved in a segment involving a wrestler's suspicious herbal tea. They made themselves at home in every room they walked into, regardless of how little sense it made on paper. What their real story shows: the draft, dodging that planted Cheech in Vancouver, the topless bar improv theater that gave them a stage, the accidental "Dave's not here" routine, the bitter creative battles, the solo years, the reunions that never quite settled the old tensions, is that their comedy was always a byproduct of something larger. Two very different people, from very different worlds, who found each other in the most unlikely room, and discovered that the friction between them could, under the right conditions, produce something that audiences could not stop watching. That is not a stoner comedy origin story. That is just a genuinely strange and human one. And the smoke, it turns out, was always the least interesting part.